Thank you so much for having us. I'm also incredibly excited to be with this group of people. I was thinking I would start out by giving a little bit of biography about Alba de Céspedes, because it's kind of hard to find it in English. So I might go on for a little while in the beginning, but then we'll quickly pivot to a broader conversation, and we'll read a little bit in Italian for us. As a disclaimer, I should say that because it's hard to find kind of a single authoritative, exhaustive source on her biography in English, this has been cobbled together from many contradictory sources that I tried to reconcile, so mostly scholarly. So apologies if you encounter any errors. I hope people following online who know better than me will, scold me in the comments. But without further ado, and if you know better too, please correct me. So, Alba de Céspedes was born in Rome in 1911 to cosmopolitan parents. Her mother, Laura, was Roman, and her father, Carlos, was a Cuban ambassador to Italy. Her grandfather on her father's side was a hero of the Cuban War of Independence, a landowner and a lawyer who freed his slaves and rebelled against the Spanish, leading in the first in a series of wars that won Cuba's independence from Spain. This was her grandfather. Later, when de Céspedes was in her 20s, her father would briefly serve as president of Cuba. So this was a well-educated, politically engaged family going back generations. You could say she had revolution in her blood. Alba spent her childhood abroad, often separate from her parents. At age 15, she married an Italian count and moved to France, where she had a son. Like Emanuela, a character in There's No Turning Back, she gave birth as a teenager before properly starting her, quote, real life, and her child was raised in a boarding school in Rome. De Céspedes separated from the Count when she was 20, and in 1931 moved from France to Rome, where she worked as a journalist and participated in the anti-fascist movement. She published her first book of stories, The Soul of Others, at age 24 in 1935. The same year, she was arrested and jailed for the first time. According to the scholar Guido Bonsavor, there was a tap on her phone, which we don't know why, but you can infer, and she was caught speaking in derogatory tones about Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. So she was arrested for anti-fascist activity and jailed for a few days. In 1938, she published her first novel, There's No Turning Back, which is what we are discussing tonight. And as Anne writes in her introduction to the book, de Céspedes' publisher, Mondadori, undertook a huge campaign to promote the book. It paid off. The novel was an instant bestseller and a critical success, getting positive reviews even in some fascist newspapers. Her publisher maintained a close relationship with Mussolini for practical reasons, and for a few years the regime didn't interfere with her success, even though her characters don't conform to the fascist moral standards of womanhood. There's No Turning Back was reprinted 12 times in 1939. By the end of 1940, it had reached its 19th reprint. It was translated into several languages, I think you said more than 33, and reprinted in other countries. But her trouble with the regime began properly in 1940 with the publication of Escape, her second book of stories. Escape was also published by Mondadori, and to smooth the path for publication, supposedly, on his advice, de Céspedes sent a letter with a copy of the book to Mussolini's private secretary. The move backfired, however, and this was the beginning of a major setback in her career. Bonsaver writes in his history of fascist censorship that Mussolini himself read the first story in the collection and wrote a handwritten memo on her letter. The first story, the only one I read, would partially confirm the comments of the anonymous letter on file. A good writer, but of immoral tales. The anonymous letter on file refers to one of many messages from informants sent to the government about de Céspedes. Those tips, combined with her increasing fame and Mussolini's read on Escape, led to a punishing period of censorship. In 1941, a film adaptation of There's No Turning Back was blocked by the Ministry of Popular Culture, and Mondadori was told to cease all reprints of There's No Turning Back and The Escape. He didn't comply. As Anne also notes in her wonderful intro, he got around the ban by calling each successive reprint of There's No Turning Back the 20th imprint. The 20th reprint. After receiving 2 anonymous tips that her house had become a meeting place for more or less covert anti-fascists, they got together and listened to BBC radio in Italian, the government issued a directive to all newspaper editors to avoid publicizing Alba de Céspedes, all of them. This cut off all critical discussion of her work, positive or negative, and severely limited her opportunities for a while as a fiction writer. She continued to write journalism, but even as a journalist was hobbled by petty bureaucratic checks like refusals to renew her passport. There's more to be said about her anti-fascism in this period, but she was not above appealing to Mussolini and saying what she needed to say to get her work out there. She mentioned being a card-carrying member of the fascist party in one of her appeals to him, though she was obviously a partisan. And when the ban on her film meant she might have to pay back the studio for the rights to her novel, which was 60,000 lira, she asked for a chance to revise the script to appease the censors. She offered to cut the character of Genia, to give Emanuela, Silvia, Anna, and Augusta more positive traits, to write a more uplifting finale, and to change the title so that it would not be associated with the banned book. Mussolini said the production could go forward under a new name, suggesting Pensione Grimaldi, or simply, amazingly, Girls. Incredible. In 1943, Italy surrenders to the Allies, and the Germans in occupied northern Italy move south. They invade Rome, and de Céspedes flees with her lover and later husband. She spends a month living in the woods until they can make a safe escape to the Allied zone, and has also translated some diaries from this period that were published in the Paris Review online, which are wonderful. I recommend reading them. And they landed in Bari, where she began broadcasting for an anti-fascist radio station under the nom de guerre Clorinda. And for this, she was reportedly jailed for a second time. She went to Naples, then returned to Rome in 1944, where she became a formidable presence on the Italian literary scene. She founded a monthly literary journal, Mercurio, a short-lived but influential forum for anti-fascist intellectuals and writers, in which she published authors like Natalia Ginzburg, Ernest Hemingway, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Alberto Moravia. After the magazine folded, I think for want of funds, she published several more novels and always chronicled the changes of the post-war period. Among those were Her Side of the Story in 1949 and The Forbidden Notebook in 1952, both of which were recently translated by Anne, and speak to the most intimate experiences of women's lives. Their mood would be familiar to readers of Elena Ferrante. They're propulsive, written with the urgency of confession, but they have a hard edge, a determination to vent bitter truths about women's lives that can't be said without disturbing the delicate social tissue spun by their reproductive labor: cooking, cleaning, caring, appeasing, deferring, loving, etc. Anyway, there's much more to be said about her incredibly interesting life. She wrote an advice column in a magazine for several years, answering women's questions about marriage and family that Sartre wanted to compile, translate, and publish. She wrote a screenplay for Antonioni called Girlfriends in 1955, and she wrote several more novels, stories, and poems. She moved to Paris, where she lived until her death. But for now, I think we should turn back to her early years in the 30s, when this book was published, her first novel. And so to begin the next portion, I would love for Anne to read a little bit from the beginning of the novel in Italian.
Apologies to any Italians in the audience. Alle ultime, where's the right distance? Alle ultime parole della suora che aveva letto la preghiera della sera, il coro svogliato delle ragazze rispose: così sia. Poi cadde un silenzio venato di impazienza. Qualche ragazza fissava incantata i ceri accesi sull'altare. Altre si volgevano verso il fondo della cappella, aspettando che un cenno della madre le mettesse in libertà. Non si parlavano neppure, ansiose d'uscire. Uscirono poco dopo, a due, ordinandosi in una colonna compatta. Traversarono l'ampio vestibolo dove, sull'opaca vetrata del portone, ancora indugiava la luce del giorno. The first paragraph.
Do you want to read it in English as well?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, she says.
As the nun read the last words of the evening prayer, an indolent chorus of girls responded, Amen. Silence followed, veined with impatience. Some of the girls stared, transfixed, at the lighted tapers on the altar. Others turned toward the back of the chapel, waiting for a sign from the Mother Superior to release them. Eager to leave, they didn't even talk to one another. Soon afterward, they filed out, 2 by 2. In a compact column, they crossed the wide hall, where daylight lingered on the opaque glass of the front door.
Thank you. So I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with the plot of this book. I'll say very simply that it's a story of how many girls? Eight young women living in a residence in Rome, all of whom are there with a different backstory. Some of them are studying, some of them are escaping a past, and the novel traces with really deft switches between different voices and different characters, their paths from girlhood into womanhood and adulthood. And the title of the book refers to a passage where one of the characters says that we're on a bridge. We're not really there yet. I'm not a girl, not yet a woman. But once we cross, there's no going back, and we're here in each other's lives now. But who knows what will happen, which is very much the case. But before we get into interesting comparisons, Anne, I wanted to ask you about your process of translation, and given the topic of the evening, how de Céspedes compares to you to Ferrante, and whether translating them was a different experience for you.
Every book is a different experience, I would say, and every book has its own difficulties. But and every author, I should also say. But they're actually kind of quite different in a way, because although their subjects are the same, or their interests are the same, that is to say the lives of women, the free lives of women, the way they get there is a little bit different. I mean, Ferrante is very, people have said she's very, her style is very propulsive. It's very, well, it also depends which book you're reading, but basically in the Neapolitan novels, it's very expansive. She tells you everything that's going on in the character's mind, in a way. And de Céspedes, in this book, it's quite compact, as she says about the lines of women. It's compact. It's intense. In this book, it is, as you said, it's incredible how she differentiates the voices of the women. Because maybe there's a line break. There's usually a line break, but the line break doesn't mean there's a change of character. But you have to be careful to make sure that every time you switch characters, the reader knows it. And also it's in the third person, I should say. So each of these characters is a third person narrator. So yeah, I think they're pretty different. I mean, I was saying before, one thing they share is that they're very good at chapter breaks. They like to leave you hanging, and they're good at plot. I mean, they're both. There's a lot of plot in both writers, but I think that there's. I mean, I wouldn't call de Céspedes spare, but she's definitely not explaining a lot. Often, you have to sort of figure it out, and she's very. Well, she's more of a stylish writer, I guess I would say. I don't know. Do you think that's a fair way to put it?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah, Judith and Joanna, I wonder what your thoughts are on the comparison between the two. We were talking backstage, and I said that I thought they were quite similar, and you both were like, well, I disagree. I think they're very different. So I'd love to hear more about what you think.
Well, I think this was there's 40 years between Ferrante, for all we know. Let's say they were born in the late 40s. And Alba de Céspedes is born before the First World War. And the other women that interest us, that we want to talk about tonight, as a kind of sisterhood of neorealist or modernist, pioneering feminist writers, were all of the same generation as Alba. Elsa Morrante, Natalia Ginzburg, and Simone de Beauvoir, who's a little bit older. So there's a huge generation gap between them. And Ferrante's narrators are women who have lived through the feminist movement. They've lived through the 70s. They've lived through women getting the vote. They've lived through all kinds of liberatory experiences. And of course that deeply, deeply colors the style, the writing, the voices of the writers. And I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, Dayna, which was that Benito Mussolini thought her writing was immoral. And that is a little vignette which I think it addresses what we've come here to discuss, which is the freedom to say, and this is something that Ferrante achieves. This is, I think, one reason for her tremendous power. She says, she insists that she can say anything. And that she insists that a woman can say anything, but more than that a woman can feel and desire anything, however taboo. And that the good little girl who doesn't ruffle Mussolini's feathers is exactly what this cohort of women writers bravely set out to do.
Exactly. Oh my God, yes. I mean, when I think of Ferrante and de Céspedes together, they are. Didn't she say that she uses it as an encouragement, not as a model? So it's kind of this slightly more classical thing in Céspedes, which for me connects with someone like Simone de Beauvoir, who's working at sort of exactly the same time, has a weirdly interesting, like comparatively biography, like Beauvoir. After the war, so that's when she really gets going. She starts her own magazine and starts to kind of talk about these things that didn't feel people could talk about before. But with Ferrante, I feel like it's the influence of like Woolf, and people are kind of letting her like move in this different way in the book, and also just the speed and the use of of those cliffhangers, of those kind of genre moments of like of letting things kind of get sexy or get like weird, and letting all of that happen in the book, and yet still wanting you to turn the page. And you're right, here there's these sections that are kind of crisper, and there's kind of more straightforward dialogue, and there's more kind of separation. And of course, the interesting thing in Ferrante, there isn't that much separation. There's these characters who are playing with each other, but also molding into each other, the two main characters.
Yes, I suppose I thought they were similar. Maybe, I mean, probably because there's the unifying influence of Anne. I'm encountering both of these texts through Anne, and Judith, I think you've implied in your writing on Ferrante that it is improved by Anne.
Many people who are bilingual readers of Ferrante have said that Anne has improved the prose. I will here say I agree. I've read Ferrante in Italian, and it's an entirely different experience. It's not an entirely different experience. It's not an entirely different experience. It's the accuracy of the passage that stunning accuracy of the passage from the De Céspedes that Anne just read in Italian and English. It's extraordinary how faithful and at the same time natural it is. Translation isn't natural. The translator is never a prism. You have to triangulate. You can't sail. You have to tack.
Right, of course, like in sailing.
But Anne is a fantastic sailor. She's just...
Yeah, I mean, I certainly enjoy reading the translations and your translations. But I think there was one stylistic similarity that was worth sort of noting to me. And this was something that Ferrante spoke about in her, I think in her Paris Review interview that she did, more than 10 years ago, where she says that she likes to write these passages, these sort of contained women, these characters who are really trying hard to keep it together, but then sort of under the pressure of emotion, they kind of start to spill over the container of their self-composure, and then suddenly you get these sort of run-on sentences of of just propulsive emotion, and they become really like expressionist and weird and often quite graphic. There's like sometimes like body horror in it, disgust, sort of all the ugly feelings, right? And there are a few moments in the novel, the De Céspedes novel, that are so striking because they break out of that mold of the sort of crisp, alternating precision that you guys were talking about. And I think, and they also come in these moments of heightened emotion. I'm trying to recall when one of them is, but I think Emanuela has one when she's sort of recalling, she's deciding whether or not to disclose the history of her child she had with a lover before she, met this guy who wants to marry her. I'll see if I can find a particular one, but that to me seemed like such a proto-Ferrante template that's sort of like alternating between restraint and overflow. But I do agree that even, in the English translated by you, there's a sort of a poetry and a precision of language and metaphor that's not really present in Ferrante. Ferrante is more kind of like you get the effect in aggregate, whereas like you will get really stunning individual lines in De Céspedes, I think.
Yes. Ferrante, as I've probably said before, she piles on the words in a way. She talks about how she wants to get to the truth of an emotion, let's say, or of anything, and to do that, she just plows through many versions of the thing until she gets to it, basically. And I think that De Céspedes doesn't really do that, although she does have those moments. Like the Valentina, the character Valentina, is full of those moments in a way.
And they're really incredible for the contrast. I think they're they're more powerful for the alternation. I wanted to talk a little bit about comparisons. We're talking about Ferrante, but there's also other novelists. You mentioned her sort of cohort of Elsa Morrante and Natalia Ginzburg, but Joanna, you also mentioned Simone de Beauvoir, and I think in an earlier correspondence you mentioned Mary McCarthy and the group and how the group compares to this. So I was wondering about what other novels and novelists came to mind while you were reading this book.
Those were really the main ones. I was thinking about Beauvoir a great deal, and in a way that kind of surprised me, because unfortunately, Beauvoir is a wonderful thinker and not a fantastic novelist. And that isn't to say that De Céspedes isn't good, but almost like De Céspedes, they knew each other, in fact. They knew each other when they lived in Paris. She almost takes the ideas that Beauvoir has that are kind of good and writes the real novel of them. Like, I was thinking very much of The Forbidden Notebook, which to me has an interesting relation with this very short story that Beauvoir wrote called La Femme Rompue, The Destroyed Woman, which was published in Elle magazine, which is kind of not as like glossy in France as it is here, but still they completely misunderstood it. Her readers wrote in and said, the story is a diary of a woman saying, my husband has left me, what am I going to do with my life? And just over 6 months, the crumbling of that. And the readers were like, oh, we loved her, we thought she was wonderful. And Beauvoir wrote it to say, women, don't put all of your eggs in one basket. Don't think that marriage and children is going to kind of be your only way of being. Try and have an intellectual life. Try and have friends. And Beauvoir was very disappointed in all of her readers. But The Forbidden Notebook, De Céspedes managed to do that idea, but actually do it properly. I think of letting two generations in and having these different The conversation that Beauvoir was having with her readers was sort of inside the book, and the book manages to show how someone who is kind of dissatisfied with marriage kind of has a way of getting out of it, as well as sort of, she ends sort of, well, I didn't know exactly what happens at the end, but I think she sort of stays in it. So as I was really interested in that kind of intellectual life that they both managed to have these ideas and put them in the novels differently, and I think, I'd love to read someone who could trace them all through.
I just want to make a quick note, which is
that... said something wrong.
No, but in The Days of Abandonment, she talks about that.
She does,
you're right.
She does.
In the very beginning of The Days of Abandonment, Ferrante talks about it.
She says, the character says that she doesn't like it, right? As a child, she's growing up and she says, I grew up reading these books. I don't want to be like these pathetic women who fall apart. And then
she's
I am.
She's a good reader.
Yeah.
Beauvoir would like her.
Yes.
The woman falling apart is a real subject, I think, that all of these women we're talking about take on, the incontinence of emotion. And Virginia Woolf, I think one of you writes in a terrific piece, I was reading that women slosh around in their field. That women's writing should not be sloshing around in your emotions. And all of these writers have this, in a way, this fear of doing that. And they try to avoid doing that in very different ways, and very different strategies for not doing it. But they all also share an image which de Céspedes calls the well. No, which Ginzburg calls the well. And you fall down to the bottom of the well, and you slosh around at the bottom of the well, and then finally you come out again and you can resume your life. And de Céspedes writes to her and says that you can fall into the well, but it can be an enriching experience. And Ferrante, Frantumalia, the title of her collection of essays, also has. First of all, she's in one of the novels. You'll know which one. She writes from the mother's womb is the place that she writes from. Where is that? Wait. Writing like a woman is writing from the depths of the maternal womb. That's in Frantumalia somewhere.
It's in Frantumalia.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah.
So there's this womb-like, dark, viscous, bloody, suffocating, but also life-giving, but also nurturing space, which for all of them is the space of women's literature. And also Virginia Woolf is someone else in this cohort. No, she was born earlier. She was born in the 1880s. But the idea also of women sloshing around and they're and they sort of idealize the male freedom from the well. I think one of them says that the men never fall into the well.
But de Céspedes also says that men could learn something from falling
Exactly.
into the well.
Yes.
And also, doesn't she say that men push women into the well?
She just said that, yeah.
But this thing about emotion is so interesting in these intellectual women because I think they're both really drawn by it, really like that, what makes them write, but at the same time they're kind of disgusted by it and want to stay kind of irrational intellectual. And I think that's a really difficult thing for anyone, any woman generally, because of the way their bodies are, that you feel, or you feel more connected to an emotional life. I mean, I don't know, like crying in public. You don't see that many men crying in public, do you?
No, I mean, it's so funny. So the well metaphor comes from this exchange of letters that I think the New York Review published your translation of them. It's Natalia Ginzburg had written for. She'd written for the paper or for the magazine, but then she said, "Oh, I wrote this other thing right after Liberation, but it felt totally dishonest. I felt like I needed to start again and say what I really think about women." And then she writes this incredible letter. She's like, "The difference between women and men is that women are always falling into wells, and men don't do that." And it's an incredible piece. I really recommend it. And this de Céspedes writes the response. I think she publishes both of them.
Yeah, she published them together.
Where she says what you said, that sometimes falling in the well is good. And when I read it, I was like, oh, not to. There's this, this resistance to essentializing for very good reasons, epistemological and political. But I was like, oh, this sounds like the estrogen roller coaster. You know what I mean? Like this, there is a little bit of a material basis to some of this, which is that like for a lot of your life, if you, like have a uterus and get, deal with estrogen going like this until you hit menopause, that happens to you all the time, and you're just falling in the well. And I know it's not quite that literal for her, but when you're saying like there is a bit of an embodied quality to it, it's like it's true. It is uncontaining and uncontainable and deeply embarrassing. And I think,
yeah, but maybe it's good. Like,
yes,
I guess, yeah.
There could be a bit more of assimilation of the sort of embarrassing, well-dwelling experience into official life. That tension of being an intellectual woman, which should not be and isn't a contradiction in terms, but is something that different generations of intellectual women, literary women, have to navigate, always includes some kind of like divided sympathy or loyalty, which is that you want to speak from your experience and be true to who you are, but also you resist ghettoization in the kind of more popular cultural expressions of your sex or your gender. And I think you see this in many different women writers, and with De Céspedes, I think part of why she wasn't, her revival hasn't happened till now is because she was sort of classified as pink literature, as a romance novelist in Italy. And so I'm curious, we talk about sort of women's writing, écriture féminine, and then there's chick lit. So what that sort of tussle and self-loathing, is that just part of the experience? Do you see that in these writers, or is that something that you feel like they kind of master in different ways?
But I don't know. Chick lit is literature that's written in a certain way, in a certain style, or with a certain absence of style, or with a certain lightness. I think there's lots of chick lit in great world. The chick lit subjects in great world literature. They're just addressed from a different perspective. I think one thing that's at the heart of all these that conflict that you speak about is motherhood and mothers, and the identification and the disidentification with the mother and with the womb. And it's interesting that De Céspedes, like her character Emanuela, has a child very, very young, and then basically abandons that child. Colette basically abandoned her only child. I'm not sure Elsa Morrante had a child. Simone de Beauvoir, of course, never has a child, and was sort of held. Her own mother was a sort of monitory figure for her, and she also lived in hotel her whole life. Just
sounds kind of glamorous.
Her room of her own was cleaned by the maid every day. So the domestic, the weight of the domestic, is something that they all struggle with, no matter how independent they are, no matter how successful they are, no matter what kind of praise they receive.
Yeah, I don't think of De Céspedes as being very domestic.
No.
She has this whole. She talks about in an interview. She talks about how she eliminates the thing she really cares about is writing. It's true, and she sort of subordinates everything else. And she said, well, in order to have time to write, I got into the habit of writing at night. She says she eliminated everything. I mean, I don't think she did literally eliminated everything, but she talked about how she would write at night, then she would sleep in the afternoon, get up in the morning, sleep for a while, and then she would attend to the things that women have to attend to, and then it would be night again, and she would write. But I'm not sure that's very practical for most people. But she doesn't talk about domestic details in the way that Ferrante does, for example.
No, it's true. I mean, she does a little bit in the Forbidden Notebook through the character.
Yeah, that's right.
She does.
Notebook,
what's her name?
And in also Della Parte and her side of the story, she also does, because that's a whole.
She does very much in Forbidden Notebooks. This woman is writing
because she's
in the account book that all Italian housewives used to have and write every cent down.
She writes at night also.
She also writes at night.
Yes,
and,
it's like
hides
and
her
hides it.
Yeah.
It's great.
Is hiding your work probably starts with Jane Austen, writing in the parlor, and whenever anybody came in, she had no privacy. She would slip the pages under a book or under a letter.
Natalia Ginzburg, though, she had children, right?
Yeah, she had children, and she loved motherhood.
It's one of the interesting things in that letter is she talks about having children and how she does say the kind of embarrassing thing that a woman is not complete without having children.
Right, but she also says in that letter something that I love so much, and that is very resonant to me as a young mother, which is I love talking to women because I know with children because I know exactly what to talk to them about. How did you feed the baby? What did you feed the baby? How often did you feed the baby? I can talk about this for literally hours. And it's completely true. It sounds so boring, but if you've had an infant, especially one who you struggle to feed, it's a very live drama with the stakes elevated by the fact that you don't sleep at all. And so I really related to that when she said that. I don't agree that a woman is not complete until she's had children, but I understand what that sort of that camaraderie that you feel is something that I totally have experienced.
I remember when I was younger feeling very jealous of men who could always talk about soccer with each other, and I could never like follow it exactly, and I was like, what would I talk about? The hairdresser? And actually this is what one talks about, right? And actually it's really nice to have things that everyone knows, that everyone can discuss, that can be moments that everyone can touch and move towards and go away from, I think.
Yeah, there's a kind of regression to the gendered mean, like when you think about being in a group of people of the same, you know, gender identity as you, like what are the things you can talk about if you have literally nothing else in common? Sometimes astrology.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Anyways, we're going far afield.
I'll come back to the fascists and talk about how the fascists exalted motherhood.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
All fascists exalt motherhood, by the way.
True.
But don't make it easy, I should say. Like part of the
canon
strategy is exalting motherhood as a way to burden individual women and families with a ton of work. You know, it's the sort of the removal of the social safety net is a kind of part and parcel of this deification of the mother. You know, like be a slave and we'll do everything and we'll worship you, but don't you dare stop doing it.
It's not just fascism, it's patriarchy.
Correct.
And, you know, it's the idea that you give woman this sop, the exaltation of her reproductive faculties, and then you send her back to the kitchen. And women have bought it, or they've been forced to accept it, or they've been forced to internalize it. It's, but the fascists do it very, with no apologies.
So, Anne, what were you going to say about the fascists?
No, I was just going to, just essentially that they had all these sort of slogans about how women should bear children. And actually, and I just read recently in this writer called Nadia Terranova, who has written a lot about de Céspedes, written introductions. She's a current Italian novelist, and she said that the mental hospitals were full of women who refused to have children.
Wow.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Yikes. When was this? Now?
In the 30s. I mean, that she wrote that now, but she was doing some research in mental hospitals, and
most of the women we consider the great women writers of history had no children, or maybe one. There were very few. There are some who had bigger families, but very, very few. It's been clear for a very long time that that's without the right support, without the right. It's not just support. It's the mental freedom. I think de Céspedes writes about this too. The idea that some women can take a train. No, it's Ginzburg. That some women can take a train and leave their children behind, and they're not hysterical. They're not dreaming that the kid is being run over or kidnapped or something like that. And that's something that is very hard won for most women with children. I think that sense of freedom of separation, the separation process, and Ginzburg said that she lamented the fact that she didn't have that freedom for herself as a mother.
Any other thoughts on this before I turn us to something else? I wanted to ask a question about reissues and translation, because Judith, you mentioned that, you know, I think you were quoting Emily Wilson saying that translation nowadays is a feminist issue, and I'd love for you to elaborate on that. And I'm curious, you know, for all of you, how you see reissues of, you know, authors in translation or not as kind of part of the same recuperating effort.
Well, Emily's the translator of the first woman to translate, she hates when someone says this, the first woman to translate the Odyssey, and she's one of the few women she also did a brilliant translation of the Iliad, which came out very recently. And in one of the introductions, or in an article that she wrote, she talks about translation as being gendered. Not that it is, but the profession is gendered. It's the helpmeet. It's like the faithful wife who types up her husband's notes, and it is paid accordingly. There's a sort of demeaning view of this extremely disciplined artistic task, and so she's sort of militant on that subject. The idea of the translator somehow, whatever his, her, or their gender, is somehow the wife in the relationship with the author. And I don't know, what do you think of that?
Well, naturally, I think it's nonsense.
Right.
I'm happy to hear that. Say more.
I mean, no, I mean it's a job. It's work.
Yeah.
It's work. It's not the work of the writer, but it's a kind of writing. I mean, it is writing. You're writing a book. You have to type the whole book, after all.
True.
But it's yeah. I mean, it's in some ways, of course, it's harder because you don't really know what the writer is thinking. When the writer uses a word that has, like, say, several meanings, you have to figure out what the closest meaning to what that writer intended is, and that's a constant fight with yourself, I would say.
That sounds incredibly difficult, and we are, at least we're also. I mean, you are also an editor. As an editor, I think the experience of collaboration, not just with the author but with other editors, really makes that difficulty easier to bear, because you can get somebody's second opinion, like, oh, I'm making this edit, do you think this is right? The idea of translating something and not having anyone to ask as the final authority is incredibly terrifying to me. Do you make that decision exclusively yourself? Do you talk to other people? How do you do that?
Most of the time I make it myself.
That's great. How do you do it?
How do I do it? I eliminate, like Alba de Céspedes, I eliminate different things for different reasons, and then I come up with what I think is the right word. And sometimes if I something that I try to avoid doing, but reading an old translation, I think that was not the right word. But
which was the hardest of Elena Ferrante's books for you, if you can say that? All.
Well, in some way, yeah, all. In some ways, Troubling Love was the hardest, because it's so elusive. And also it was the first one I did was The Days of Abandonment, and that was in some ways that wasn't hard because it was an experience that seemed very vivid and real, and that so many people had in one form or another. Whereas Troubling Love is very complex, and it's full of references to things that you don't require research and just figuring out what's going on. I mean, I love that book, but I thought
I really love it.
Yeah, I thought it was complicated.
It's dreamlike. It's surreal.
Yeah, right.
It's surreal.
Yeah.
You said it earlier on there were particular difficulties. What is there a particular difficulty in Ferrante that when you?
Well, in the Neapolitan novels, the difficulty was to keep the sentences like Ferrante's, conveying the same emotion and the same content, and have it read in English as English. So I think that balance was really hard.
You do it beautifully. I was noticing in that first paragraph, veined. We don't use veined in that way, that verb that often, but it's perfect in it.
Yeah,
and it feels right. It feels idiomatic, but slightly unusual in a good way.
Funnily, oddly, it's almost a literal translation of the word venato, but just to say that sometimes the literal word is the right word.
Right.
And
the image is perfect.
And you can't run away from that.
Have you read any of de Céspedes' advice columns?
No, but she says in this interview that I saw on YouTube, which is the only interview of her actually speaking that I could find. She says that most of the letters were written by men, and that she wasn't really giving advice. She just wanted to write about these issues. But I don't know if that's really true.
I just wanted to.
I have seen them, and I
it's interesting that Sartre wanted to publish them.
Yeah.
That's.
Yeah, you have to report back.
Yeah.
Because I don't. There's no way they were mostly men. You think?
That's what she.
That's what she said. Wow.
But I don't. I don't know.
Beauvoir had a Vice column, and I think in the Tom. I think she did. Yeah, towards the end. Yeah.
This is a great future panel. The advice columns of
Yes,
great
the Q&A
writers.
is actually just going to be like
Most of whom were completely crazy. They should not be.
Yeah.
But just so the audience knows, there's an absolutely wonderful figure of this same generation, whose name is Greta Stern, like Stern, and she was a designer of the Bauhaus and Jewish, and she and her husband, who was not Jewish, went back to his native Buenos Aires, where she had a career, very important career as a photographer. And she illustrated for a women's magazine the letters columns, the advice columns, which were, the advice was given by men to the women readers. And she,
More normal.
and yes, but her illustrations, these photographic illustrations, are so subversive.
What do they look like? Can you explain?
Well, for example, one of them shows one of those Chinese lamps, which some of us of a certain age inherited from our grandmothers, a figure of a Chinese lady with a lampshade, a frilled lampshade, a pleated lampshade, but the figure is life-size, it's surrealist, it's blown up, and there's the button, the little switch. There's a man's finger on the switch, so he's turning her on. Very, very subversive, and they're dreamlike. So it's this, I think subversiveness is another great commonality that these writers have. In fact, I think if anybody writes Ferrante's biography, they could call it Lies and Sortileges, which is the title of a great book by Elsa Morrante that was recently published.
Well, I mean, you could say that There's No Turning Back is a completely subversive book in its time. I mean, all of these women are really rebelling, not that they necessarily know it, but they are. And they're all different forms of rebellion.
Yeah, there is some little
That's
women.
really important. That actually defines the book. Never thought about it that way. It frames it, because some of them don't know they're rebellion.
No.
Some of them have failed rebellions, and some of them have half-cooked rebellions, and some of them
Yeah, but they're against the patriarchy.
they're against the patriarchy.
No, and it makes the book feel incredibly modern and contemporary, sort of in the same way that you watch like a pre-Hays Code Hollywood movie and it feels shockingly contemporary, because before this, like, you know, stupidification of everything under censorship, like you got to see people talking like adults, and so it's sort of before. I don't know, but it's just the 30s that there's so much in there. I wanted to mention Vivian Gornick because, Judith, you mentioned her backstage as another person who
You've written about her.
Yeah, I have. So what made you think of Gornick when?
Well, I wanted us to talk about the next generation. I'm very old now, and my mother is the contemporary of de Beauvoir. They were born exactly the same year, in fact. So I wanted to talk about this, taking this revolution, this search for the way women write, and what is women's writing, onwards, and talk about that, how you all feel, and I thought your piece on Vivian Gornick, which is really wonderful, it's loving and it's critical, and it's so I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit. Do you see Gornick is in this sorority? In this?
I do, in a way. She's interesting. I mean, she's so brilliant. I think that what makes her, the kinship here is that this incredible struggle for independence, as if she's like resisting, kind of like being sucked back into the world of her mother. And she has written an incredible memoir called Fierce Attachments. It's quite old now, but it's wonderful if you haven't read it.
And that could be the title for all these works.
Yeah, totally. Fierce Attachments. It's an incredible title. She's so smart. But with Vivian Gornick, she came up as a writer through the Village Voice. She had a sort of a literary background, but she became the kind of women's movement correspondent because she was going to all these, feminist gatherings downtown. She wrote the piece for the New York Times Magazine about consciousness raising, basically transcribing a consciousness raising group. And she was also kind of in this project of dignifying these degraded, feminized forms of, like the advice column and the diary, and the sort of the oral history. And for her, she kind of invented this personal essay nonfiction genre at the time in the 70s. She called it personal journalism, which did not stick. But now it's
everywhere.
It's everywhere. And I don't think it would be without her.
Who in your generation, the two of you, who's in this line, this lineage? What writers are in this lineage for you?
I think of like Claire Louise Bennett. I think of Emma McBride. Help me out here. You're younger than me. Who else is there?
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's a hard question because I think when you're in it, it's difficult to see, who's doing feminism and who's just being a woman writer, And I think that. We're in a reactionary period now, and who's to say what the next 10 years will look like. But as the culture becomes more permissive, like where one is encountering resistance and is pushing back becomes sort of hard to feel. I think that she's not my generation; she's older than me, but I see people reacting very strongly to Miranda July in her new novel, All Fours, which is a book about perimenopause and kind of figuring out how to get free of the kind of constricting bonds of motherhood and partnership, even when you're married to like a good man and you have a good life, but you're still not completely yourself and not completely free. And to me, I think that, that's been I think that book really kind of animated a lot of people the way that Ferrante sort of touched a lot of people.
I can't believe I didn't say Sheila Heti.
Oh, Sheila Heti, of course.
Sheila Heti. And of course, Rachel Cusk, whose subject has been exactly this, the freedom to be a writer.
Yes, but I think that one thing that feels very contemporary, especially compared with Ferrante's narrators and, obviously de Céspedes, is that is confronting the sort of internalized limitations, the self-limitations, that are not necessarily someone saying, get back in the kitchen, but the guilt, the things mom guilt, the things that are the invisible chains, as it were.
Well, it reminds me of the Room in One's Own. The whole point of that book is not really about the room or the lock on the door or the 500 a year, but it's like all the things that stop you from doing that writing. So all of the kind of ways that you inhibit your own freedom as a woman, all the ways you stop yourself from doing things that you might have done, not thought to stop yourself if you're a man, perhaps.
Rachel Kushner, do you think that she's?
I think that her project is different.
Yeah.
I think I would say she's doing a different project.
Yeah. Can we bring up the subject of Alice Munro?
Sure. Yes, please.
Because in terms of how women write and women's writing and the conflict between motherhood and art, this is sort of an elephant in the room, I think.
Oh, I mean, it's. I think the murmuring ripple in the audience suggests that everyone knows that what we're talking about. But for anyone who doesn't, after she died, Alice Munro's daughter came forward publicly saying that her mother enabled, years-long sexual abuse by her stepfather, and kind of never, and it destroyed their relationship, and she never kind of came back from it. And there was a really incredible piece in the New Yorker by Rachel Aviv going through both Munro's stories and correspondence with the daughter and the other siblings about how everything sort of happened. And I mean, it's interesting. I was having a conversation with my partner, and he said that he saw it as a conflict between being an artist and being a writer, being a writer and being a mother, that it was about being a good mother versus having the material. And I don't think that was it. Like, I think that what's so kind of sad and messed up about the situation is that it was about competitiveness and insecurity. Like, she was threatened by the sexual competition of her child, who was being abused by her husband.
it seemed to me also, this wasn't, in Rachel's piece is absolutely brilliant, that the pathology of this story is that Alice Munro's total craven submission to this sexual predator who may also have murdered somebody and raped and murdered somebody.
I forgot about that part.
Yes, paid for her freedom. She needed that submission. She needed somehow the glue, the structure, that cocoon, that sort of hard cocoon of his power over her. Yeah. And so, I don't know, it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, it is. And I think it speaks exactly to this conundrum of freedom and constriction. Like, maybe she didn't need that in him, but she needed it somewhere. Yeah. And that's one of the great themes of her writing. Which
I wish Ferrante would write something, transform that story into fiction. So that
she could. I think we're going to take some questions from the audience. Just raise your hand and I'll call.
Turn that light
maybe
down
dim the lights as well a little bit so we can see people
in the audience.
That's possible.
Someone's brave enough to go first, and then other people will have questions. It always happens that way.
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I was just curious how you approach Italian culture within your work. So when you're reading it, and as you come across literary references or cultural references that will likely be lost on a non-Italian reader, how do you approach that, and what kind of compromises are you willing to make or not willing to make?
Oh, so we should repeat the question for the people online. The question was for Anne, I assume. How do you address particularities of Italian culture or history in the books? And I think you're sort of asking how much are you willing to sort of concede to the ignorance of the English reading audience versus kind of leave slightly obscure out of fidelity.
Well, there's very many different ways of doing it. I mean, and it really depends on the context and what the issue is. I mean, sometimes I put a word in Italian and then I put the translation or the explanation. When it's not a question of just a word, it's a reference to something. I mean, sometimes there are footnotes. I don't really like to use footnotes, but some other translators I know really like them. It just really depends. I mean, sometimes you can just leave something. Sometimes, actually, with the De Céspedes books, I tried to explain everything in the translator's note. That's actually, in some ways, that's the best way. But there weren't that many things to explain, and they were pretty straightforward. But yeah.
You translated frantumaria, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because Anne came up, frantumaria. It's a word in the dialect of Campania, and it means your translation, because I wrote it down. It just, yeah, because it speaks to the well, it speaks to the womb, and it is the debris in the muddy water of the brain.
Whoa.
Yeah, it is an untranslatable word, and that is what it means. Awesome. And that is what great translation is.
Thank you.
Wait, can you read that again? The debris.
Frantumaria is the word.
The well.
It's the well. It's the well. And the debris in the muddy water of the brain.
The debris in the
muddy water of the brain. We all have that. I have it almost all the time. Yeah.
That's so metal.
One of you, in one of your essays, you were quoting Virginia Woolf, women should stop sloshing around in their emotions.
I think that must have been Joanna.
Yeah.
I like things like that, yeah. I like sloshing around in my emotions. I'm sure I quoted that, yeah.
And Ginzburg had wanted to, I made all these notes, but then I didn't write down where they came from. Ginzburg had wanted to, quote, write like a man. Yeah.
Any other audience questions? In the front first, and then we'll do in the back.
Alba de Céspedes wrote that style is everything.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Style is everything, Alba de Céspedes said. And I wondered if that informs did you pay particular attention to style?
No, not really. I mean, I always try to pay attention to style, whatever that style is. I mean, people say Ferrante is a different style, but it's a style. So I mean, I think I always try to pay attention to what's there.
And sorry, just to repeat the question.
Oh yeah, I forgot.
Afterward, it was de Céspedes said style is everything. So the question was there special attention that Anne paid to de Céspedes' style versus others? And it seems like style is style, must be tended to. Yes, in the back. Do you still have a question?
Sure, yeah. I was curious just to go back to the kind of subversion question about when Céspedes' books and the others too, when they first came out, how were they greeted? Were they seen as revolutionary? Were they sort of, were they rejected by the sort of Italian public and the global public? Were they welcomed? I'm just kind of curious a little bit more about how they were kind of seen at the time. To Dana's point, like they still feel very modern and with kind of provocative points to make. I'm curious how they were received back in the 1940s and 50s.
So the question is, how were these books received at the time? Were they received as revolutionary?
You had those figures about the
reprints. I'll read them again. They're
I mean, how
insane. Yeah.
I mean, it was very popular.
Yes, extremely. And so, I mean, let me find it. It was reprinted 12 times in 1939. It was published in 1938 in December, which was the big publishing month in Italy. It's reprinted 12 times in 1939, and by the end of 1940 had reached its 19th imprint. So it's so obviously it was received very, very well by the people, by the readers. And for this book in particular, the criticism was good. Like across the board, she got, I think, good reviews from different kind of publishers. But I didn't read anything in particular about the books being taken as especially subversive, which is interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't actually know the answer. As for Ginzburg, Elsa Morrante, do you have an idea?
I don't really. Do you?
I just know that Historia, Elsa Morrante's arguably greatest novel masterpiece, was a huge bestseller, partly because it's a great book, but partly because it's an incredible sprawling saga of Italy, and it was, she insisted on having it printed in paperback so it would be affordable to many, many people, which hardback books in Europe are expensive, and still are.
Mm-hmm. It was also later.
Yes, but I wanted to ask Anne a follow-up to that, which is that Morrante and Ginzburg and de Céspedes were in some ways embraced by readers, their contemporary readers, and Ferrante made her mark here, made her mark in English. Mm-hmm. And the Italians my Italian friends are all Ferrante, sort of poo-poo her. I wanted you to...
That's been my experience as well with Italian friends.
They don't see what's the big fuss about.
Well, until she was famous here,
right.
And sold a lot of books, and then they decided she was okay. But I remember going to the first time that she was accepted as an academic subject. The women who were sort of interested in her and wanted to study her and write about her, they were like practically in tears. It was such a great moment for them.
Wow, that's incredible.
There's an interesting parallel with de Céspedes too, because she moved to Paris and then sort of her legacy was kind of fractured by not being in Italy. And I mean, she wrote a novel in French as well from scratch in French. So that changed her legacy. And I think sometimes when these writers get forgotten, it's not because they weren't popular at the time, but it's like something happens later on in their careers, which makes there's like a kind of gap between either we didn't have Ann Goldstein yet to translate it, certain things, so we couldn't read them, so we didn't know them. Things fall out of fashion. Things are kind of like said, oh, they're really trashy, and then turns out that they're really interesting books. So there's often like this gap. And she lived quite a long time. She lived in 1997, de Céspedes. So I wonder if that was a little bit of it, moving to another language where she felt more at home, but then like broke that initial connection with Italy.
I don't know. I wish I could remember who said this, but no one is a prophet in their own country. There was a question here and then one over here.
My question was,
So where would we place George Sand in the scheme of the feminist novelists?
Well, I guess because she was so family-oriented, she was so social-oriented.
Yes, family.
I think the great masterpiece, the great masterpiece of Georges Sand is her life, and what she represented, and the inspiration.
Even with the children, she wrote all night.
Yes, she had children, and she had a big house, and she had thousands of houses. She wasn't doing the cooking, and nevertheless, and many lovers. She had an amazingly rich life, and she. And despite the dressing as a man and all the rest of the sort of performative, as we now say, aspect of her rebellion, she relished motherhood and sex and love and all the rest. Her novels aren't that they're interesting. But they're not great literature, I don't think.
I haven't read them, so.
No,
That
I agree.
says a lot.
Indiana isn't great.
Is
When
it?
I read it a few years ago, it's not fantastic, no. And someone like George Eliot, who actually was a stepmother, so she did have these 3 boys that she took on, also wrote wrote better, probably.
Some of the women writers who had the greatest freedom had spouses who took the wifely role, which was the case of George Eliot and George Lewis, and the case of Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf. And they just broke the mold, and those women did have, quote, a man's, quote unquote, freedom to work and the support of a spouse who was investing his energy in her art.
Question over here? Okay, so last question.
For any or all of you, as a matter of American literary culture, especially when it comes to foreign translated writers, have you thought about why a Ferrante happens? Or are there many Ferrantes and we just don't know about them? And it isn't just about women writers, because you can think of Roberto Bolaño as a moment, or Knausgaard, but are these writers all out there? And it's interesting tonight to hear you talk about many other women writers as well.
So to paraphrase, please correct me if I have this wrong, the question is, in the context of American culture, how does a Ferrante happen? Like, how do we get a sort of literary sensation? And are there a lot of them out there that have not yet been translated and discovered? Or is this just what we get? Is that sort of what you're asking? Okay, and I feel like that's a good question for you.
Really?
Yes, you're the translator.
But I only I know what I translate.
I have an anecdote about this, actually. So Ferrante sort of happened when I was still in London at the London Review of Books. And one day my editor, the boss, Mary Kay Wilmers, came over to my desk and just said, this doesn't happen very often, talking about Ferrante. And I think it's true that it just doesn't happen very often. I feel very, privilege is a stupid word, but I feel very happy to know that I was here for when it did and was able to see it and be part of it. And I have friends that I've just made through being like, oh my God, have you read The Last Ferrante? And it's happening with The Forbidden Notebook. It's happening with Céspedes too. Like, I talked to people about, I'm doing this talk, and they were like, oh my God, The Forbidden Notebook. Have you read it? Have you read it? I've read it. It's so important. And so it's just, I think it's really, really rare. I don't know what you would think, Judith, but
No, I think it's as a phenomenon, it's really rare. But I want to say something about the state of translation in the United States, which is that in Europe, publishers routinely translate great quantities of foreign literature, especially English literature, but the literature of other languages. And this country, 3% of the books that are published are books in translation. And many of the publishers are so wary of the unprofitability, the resistance of readers to writing in foreign language, that they put the translator's name on the inside but not on the cover.
Right, which seems so old-fashioned.
It's retarded.
But I guess
it's ritardato.
But there are publishers who do it. Fitzcarraldo in the UK and New Directions here. They really...
And New York Review of Books.
Yeah, exactly. Get these incredible books because no one else is paying attention because they're in another language.
Right.
They don't put the name on the cover?
The name of the translator.
If it's Geraldo.
They've just changed that. I knew they've changed that, yeah.
Yeah, that was something else that Emily Wilson was very.
Yeah, so if we have one action item tonight, it's put the translator's name on the cover, please. Do we have to end? Unfortunately, we have to end. I want to thank everyone. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for having us.